Is this how you feel when you see those seemingly impossible reading passages stuffed into Module 2? If so, you need to watch this video. Today, I'm going to be going over the absolute hardest reading questions I've ever seen to help you confidently ace these questions on your next SAT. Okay, starting off with question 1. Data collected by the Mars rover Curiosity at the Gale Crater's Murray Formation are suggestive of hydrological deposition of sediment in the distant past. To characterize the nature of the depositional environment, Franco Rivera Hernandez and his researchers analyzed the grain size of Murray Formation sediment, finding that although there are intervals of coarse grains, let me underline that, most of the sediment consists of fine grains that show signs of cracking due to episodic desiccation. Rivera Hernandez and his team concluded that the coarse grains are sandstone, which tends to be deposited by flowing water, whereas the fine grains are mudstone, which is slowly deposited by settling out of suspension in low flow water, leading the researchers to posit that. So, main takeaway. There are intervals of coarse grains of sandstone deposited by flowing water, think rivers and streams, though most of the sediment consists of fine grains of mudstone with episodic desiccation. These are deposited by low flow water, like a lake. Alright, so now what we want to do is we want to look at these answer choices and based off of what we see in the last sentence and the passage as a whole, select the one that most logically fits in the blank. So let's take a look at the answer choices. A. Although the site of the Murray Formation experienced a prolonged period of dryness that prevented a lake from forming, water flowing from a distant source was present. Now, this doesn't make any sense as it completely contradicts what's mentioned in the text, right? If a lake was prevented from forming, that would mean the slow and gradual deposition of fine grains that we need wouldn't occur, and we need this for a consistent low flow body of water, and that's going to characterize a lake. But here, we don't even see a lake forming, which doesn't make any sense. And that's another thing, right? They don't mention lakes or streams or rivers in the passage, but you're supposed to use the context you have to connect low flow to lake and flowing water to like rivers and streams. So for all these reasons, A is going to be out. B. One or more streams existed on the Murray Formation for an extended period until they were replaced by a lake that persisted for only a brief period before permanently dying. Again, B is going to contradict the details in the passage. If multiple streams existed for an extended period of time, with a lake briefly forming, that would mean we'd see a lot more coarse grains because there's going to be a lot more flowing water, right? And we'd only see a small section of some fine grains when the lake existed before drying out. So that's like a flip of all the details we see in the passage. And so that's why B is going to be wrong. C. A stream-fed lake was present at the Murray Formation for an extended period. And although the streams experienced occasional drying, the lake did not. So answer choice C rightly mentions that the stream experienced occasional drying, which makes sense because coarse grains were deposited in sporadic intervals. But C says that the lake did not experience drying, which is inaccurate because if we look at the passage, it is explicitly stated that the episodic desiccation occurred. The sediment contains fine grains that show signs of episodic desiccation, says that right here, which is a fancy way to essentially describe the process of drying out. And here it says the lake didn't dry out, which contradicts what we see there. And so C is out, and that leaves us with D, our right answer. But D basically says a lake existed at the Murray Formation for a prolonged period, though it occasionally experienced drying. Okay, so this matches a detail that we previously discussed in answer choice C. And there were periods in which one or more streams were present. And so this is going to support the fact that we can see the coarse grain deposits occurring in intervals. Though these grains were not the grains being deposited the most. Again, it is not coarse grains that are primary, the fine grains are primary. And so that's why D is going to be right, because it accurately matches with all the details we see in the passage. Alright, moving on to question number 2. Exclusively inhabiting tropical countries such as Fiji, wild chimpanzees lack adaptations to seasonal variations in UVB or ultraviolet B irradiance from sunlight. Since UVB exposure enables vertebrates to synthesize more vitamin D, okay, so more UVB, more vitamin D. That's a correlation we can establish. This raises questions about how chimpanzees in mid-latitude zoos are affected by the seasonal variations in UVB irradiance that occur in those locations. In a study of zoo chimpanzees in France and other mid-latitude countries, Sarah Woodland and colleagues found that vitamin D levels are lower in spring than in summer, which parallels UVB irradiance, but also that regardless of season, again, when we see these big tone shifters, we have to underline them and look at the relationship between the sentence before and after because they're going to be essential to how we interpret the passage. So, regardless of season, chimpanzees with unlimited outdoor access have higher vitamin D levels than chimpanzees with limited outdoor access. These findings suggest that what? Which choice most logically completes the text? Okay, so taking a look at the answer choices. A. Giving zoo chimpanzees in France and other mid-latitude countries unlimited outdoor access during spring may help offset the effect of reduced UVB irradiance relative to summer. Okay, so this answer choice basically posits that giving chimps in mid-latitude countries unlimited outdoor access might and somewhat offset the fact that UVB irradiance is not as prominent in the spring as compared to, in the summer. And especially now, if we look at this last sentence, right, it asserts that irrespective of seasonal differences, so whether that's spring, winter, or summer, if you put a chimp outside all the time, as opposed to, a combination of being inside and outside, they're going to synthesize more vitamin D. All right, so far, this does seem to make sense, right? If chimps are outside all the time, then that might help them make more vitamin D because the findings here show that this will happen regardless of some seasonal differences. And the key here is that the word may is being used. So though this, what we see right here, makes logical sense, nothing like a study has been conducted to confirm such a relationship. So if they use more absolute words like must or would, you could categorize it as an over-inference. So far A seems right, but I think we could find a better answer choice. So I'm just going to leave A right there. B. All right, answer choice B. Adaptations to seasonal variations in UVB irradiance may be emerging in zoo chimpanzees with unlimited outdoor access in France and other mid-latitude countries. Okay, so B also comes off as right. But again, the biggest mistake students make in the SAT is over-inferring. Here in B it says the higher vitamin D levels in chimps with unlimited outdoor access can be explained by a biological change, evolution. And there's just a lack of concrete information in the passage that even entertains the idea of an adaptation occurring, which makes this a huge overinference, right? All we know is that increased exposure leads to better synthesis of vitamin D, but we can't connect this to an evolution, and so I'm going to get rid of B for that reason. All right, C. The amount of outdoor access received by zoo chimpanzees in France and other mid-latitude countries affects those chimpanzees' vitamin D levels more than do seasonal variations in UVB irradiance. Again, C is an over-inference and it compares two variables that we have no data or information to do so. And here it is posited that the amount of outdoor access received by zoo chimpanzees affects their vitamin D levels more than do seasonal variations in UVB irradiance. And so what does this mean? It's basically saying that the effect of the amount of outdoor access on vitamin D levels is greater relative to seasonal variations. And there's just no comparative relationship between the two categories. So it'd be inaccurate to kind of infer any correlation between those two variables. And I'm going to get rid of C for that reason, leaving me with D. Okay. In mid-latitude countries such as France, zoo chimpanzees with unlimited outdoor access tend to synthesize more vitamin D per unit of UVB irradiance in summer than they do in spring. So immediately after reading this, I see a new term being mentioned that I haven't even seen in the passage. Per unit of UVB irradiance. So in the context of the passage, it seems like it's saying that in the summer, chimps synthesize more vitamin D per whatever metric UVB is measured in compared to chimps in the spring. And this happens when both groups of chimps have unlimited outdoor access. And this seems like it makes sense, but again, we have no data to support this claim. The passage we see right here links vitamin D levels with UVB irradiance. Nothing to do with efficiency per unit. For all we know, there could just be more units in the summer but a lower efficiency per unit, and this isn't for us to assume or even conclude. Remember, the knowledge we have is in the passage alone and only in the passage. We can't infer even if we know some things outside of the passage. So inferring relationships and the SAT answer choices do a great job of throwing you off. So if you don't fall for that trap and you just look at the passage and what's in there, it's going to be a lot easier to get these right answer choices. So if you don't know, D's wrong, and that's why we're left with A, so I'm just going to select A as the right answer choice. Alright, moving on to the final question of the video. Scholars cite Mr. President, the 1946 novel by this Guatemalan author, as a foundational text of magical realism, the Latin American style of fiction in which anti-realistic plot devices, often borrowed from spiritual and narrative traditions of indigenous and colonial societies in the Americas, are deployed in an otherwise realistic mode of representation typical of the modern novel. This style has exerted a decisive influence on authors around the world, such as this woman, whose 1996 novel resembles classic magical realist novels in its juxtaposition of literary realism with folklore, namely that of Poland. So which quotation here in the answer choices best supports what's in this underlined sentence? A. Like many works in the Latin American magical realist tradition, this novel is indebted to anti-realistic elements in the folklore of Poland. This is going to make sense, but it completely ignores literary realism in the relation of juxtaposition. B. While this novel alternates between realistic and anti-realistic modes of representation, details suggesting the influence of Polish folklore nevertheless occurred throughout the novel. So this is going to set up a concessive structure using while and nevertheless that it doesn't really make any sense, right? It says basically that the presence of folklore occurs despite the alternation of realistic and anti-realistic modes of representation. That doesn't really read right. Also, we are looking for a juxtaposition, not an alternation, and alternations do not suggest contrasting elements. And so if we were to look at the passage right here, right, it says, style of fiction in which anti-realistic plot devices are deployed in an otherwise realistic mode of representation, which does not suggest an alternation. C. Although Polish folklore clearly informs the style and occasionally anti-realistic plot of the novel, it also shows the inarguable influence of the magical realist tradition in Latin America. So C is sort of irrelevant since the underlined portion is kind of trying to explain why some feature of the work in question resembles magical realist novels. And though true, asserting the influence of the magical realist tradition directly is not going to be very supportive of the claim. So with these questions, a lot of the answer choices can be true, but what we're looking for is what directly and best supports the answer choice. So C's wrong. D, the logic of the realistic plot of this novel is repeatedly and productively disrupted by the presence of imagery and situations drawn from Polish folklore. And this is going to perfectly capture the juxtaposition we're looking for, and that's something that contrasts with what we saw in B, which is wrong. And it also demonstrates anti-realistic plot devices that are derived from cultural folklore and deployed within a realistic framework as mentioned here. And so this realistic framework detail is going to be supported by the fact that such disruptions are occurring productively and not out of place or like unordinarily. And D is going to be right. That's going to be our final answer.